So I'm very honored to have an opportunity to speak to you about this issue. I decided to ditch the PowerPoint. It wasn't adding a whole lot of value, and I wanted to depart from my usual slides and about the basics of, why we really don't want election fraud and that sort of thing, and try to approach this talk as being an outsider from the computer security community, looking in and trying to take a broader view than just computer security. So I sometimes read about myself in the paper, particularly in the early days, after talking to some journalist who says computer security expert David Dill, and I sort of cringe. I never advertised myself as that, and in fact the closest I've come to an exploit is logging into my own machine with my own account and own password. I don't always succeed at that. So I have learned a little bit about computer security, largely through work in electronic voting, and sometimes my work in formal verification impinges in computer security and gets cited by papers at USENIX and that sort of thing. But I'd really like to position myself as an outsider here and talk to people who are insiders from that perspective. So I got involved in, as Bill said, in late 2002 and 2003, and I was basically just reading about electronic voting, and there was a very high level of paranoia on the internet about this, and so I thought about it from the perspective of a computer scientist. Basically, I had no idea what was going on in the machines. I had no proof that anything had been hacked or whatever, but at some point the question boiled down to, why should we trust these machines? And I couldn't get an answer to that question, and that disturbed me greatly. And I remember over time, I remember one particular point where I asked my wife, I wonder what would happen if I just wrote a petition and got every computer scientist in the world to sign it. And I think she said something about you'll spend the next 4 years of your life doing nothing else. But I set out to do that, and I didn't succeed in getting all of the computer scientists in the world to sign it. And eventually the issue had enough momentum that while the petition is still there and you can still sign it, I'm not really advertising it for those purposes. But it's really had quite a large impact. That this is a public policy issue where computer scientists and people in computer security have probably had more impact than any other issue, at least that I can think of. And that's quite an amazing thing for people who mostly want to debug code and stuff. So the threat at that time, in 2002 and 2003, was that there had recently been a bill passed basically in response to the Florida 2000 meltdown that was going to provide funding and some amount of encouragement for essentially every state and county in the United States to buy new voting equipment, and it looked like most of those states and counties were going to buy paperless electronic voting systems. So for me it looked like democracy was just swirling down the drain, and I think that anybody else who took a good look at that and knew the technology might have felt the same way. And in fact, a lot of computer scientists sort of, I found very few computer scientists that actually disagreed with me on that issue. So when I wrote the resolution on electronic voting, I did consult with all the experts I could find because I was terrified of getting in the situation where after a few months I learned a bit more about the issue and had to say, oh, never mind. And so I wanted to make sure that I was on solid ground. And it was very hard to be on solid ground because it was almost impossible to find anything out about how the machines worked, in addition to the fact that I didn't know that much about election administration and I didn't know that much about computer security. So the resolution on electronic voting was written very broadly, and it was really making best case assumptions about the security design of voting machines. I assumed that sort of every reasonable measure had been taken to make sure that the code was correct. In fact, that the code in the machines was correct, that every reasonable measure had been made to protect them from external attacks. And what I was left with was still the nagging doubt that there was no reason I could trust the machines. And so I'll quote from the resolution on electronic voting. It runs to about 3 pages, but I'll stop after two or three sentences. Computerized voting equipment is inherently subject to programming error, equipment malfunction, and malicious tampering. It is therefore crucial that voting equipment provide a voter-verifiable audit trail, by which we mean a permanent record of each vote that can be checked for accuracy by the voter before the vote is submitted and is difficult or impossible to alter after it has been checked. So that claim that is inherently subject to essentially bugs, equipment failure, and malicious tampering has almost nothing to do with the susceptibilities that we now know of this equipment to external attacks by hackers, right? It's really a question of how can we trust the people who design and build the machines and program them? How can we trust the people who put them together, who may not build them the way they're specified? And it's really a testament to the inherent ununderstandability of computer systems at the level that would be necessary to determine whether a system can be trusted or not. So it's a robust statement in the sense that you can learn a whole lot about the details of electronic voting and about the details of about election administration. You can learn a lot of surprising things and still not be wrong. And I think that was part of why the statement appealed to many of the people who signed it. And at the end of the day, I think that the resolution on electronic voting stands up pretty well. That the description of the problem, while not particularly detailed, is still valid. And the solution is more or less, that we proposed, is more or less valid. I will get to that in a little bit. So as I mentioned, prior to the middle of 2003, we had essentially no understanding of the internals of the machines, except maybe for Peter Neumann, who had analyzed some of the machines that New York City had proposed to purchase in the early 1990s and concluded that they were horribly flawed. But the rest of us, unless you worked for a voting machine company, had no idea what was inside the machines, and we're still making best case assumptions about how they worked. And still, you could argue that there was no reason to trust them. Then Bev Harris liberated the source code for the Diebold AccuVote TS, and I'm proud to say that I instigated the study by Kono, Stubblefield, Rubin, and Wallach, dissecting the source code of the Diebold AccuVote TS in mid-2003, and then eventually, very quickly, that hit the New York Times, and the quote was something about horrible, horrible flaws, because they found just incredibly naive, stupid errors in the security design of the machines, things that I had not anticipated when I originally went around trying to recruit computer scientists for the cause. Those problems, of course, included hardwired pins and hardwired cryptographic keys, in addition to lots of other blunders in the security design. Now, of course, these were fixed, and we'll never hear about problems like that again. You can eagerly await the talk after mine. In August 2003, Avi organized a panel at this conference about electronic voting, and I was on that panel. And I remember at the time feeling that I was very seriously outgunned. At that time, civil rights groups were opposed to what we were doing in many cases because they felt that the touchscreen machines would would enfranchise more voters. A mistake that I think it was a mistake on their part, and I think it's a mistake that's largely been corrected, but that was the perception at that time. And I remember getting an email saying that these computer scientists were chicken littles or something like that, signed by the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, representing a list of 180 organizations, including individual organizations with literally millions of members. And so that was a little bit intimidating. There was a lot in the press claiming that the machines were actually secure. The propaganda apparatus of the various vendors was in full cry. The authors of the original Help America Vote Act weren't very happy with us. A couple of computer scientists had emerged that were speaking out on the other side. And there were only a few of us. And at the time, I remember feeling like I was just going to be crushed. And without actually having tears in my eyes, what I said at this panel is that the integrity of the voting system right now really rests on the shoulders of the computer scientists and the computer security community in general, and that we need help. And it was basically a plea to the people who attend USENIX to get involved in this and try to see what they can do to help. I didn't have a clear idea of what could be done by the computer security community. I now have a much clearer perception of that, which I will talk about in a little bit too. So in the there were already people involved at that time, quite a few of them, not the least was Avi, of course, and Dan Wallach, and people like Peter, who've been involved for many, many years before that. But we didn't have sort of thundering hordes of computer security experts getting involved in the issue. Since that time, there's really been an incredible response to the problem of e-voting among the computer security community. I think you folks should be really, really proud of your colleagues who've taken the time to learn about these issues, deal with politicians and the press in ways that not everybody is comfortable doing, and sacrificing months and months and sometimes years of their time getting involved in the technical issues and helping people like California's Secretary of State understand the security of their machines. I'm really proud of the community, and you know, I think it's an outstanding and perhaps unparalleled example of public service by computer scientists in dealing with a public policy issue. The computer security community has probably been, well, I'm not sure it's the most important force in the voting integrity movement or whatever you want to call it, but it's certainly been key, and I don't think that we would have made the kind of progress we have without it. And of course, I can mention some of the studies here. Now, I've already mentioned the one by the Johns Hopkins Rice report, but of course there was the YouTube video sometime by last year or whatever by Feldman, Halderman, and Felton demonstrating the virus that could propagate through memory cards on the Diebold AccuVote TS system, which they had acquired by means that I still haven't fully understood, but they had one for 3 months and they had a chance to torture it at length and show the results to great effect. And of course, most recently, California's top-to-bottom review, which essentially shows that an anonymous poll worker or even maybe a voter can corrupt not only the machine that they're using, but potentially the entire election system for a county by the next election. And so I won't go into the details of that, but David Wagner is giving a talk right after mine where he will talk about that. So I hope that you'll hang around and be interested in that. The California top-to-bottom review, if you look at the list of names and the amount of talent represented there, people who are probably not making a vast amount of money in that enterprise, it's really incredible. You know, it's not quite the Manhattan Project or whatever, but I can't think of another instance where I've seen a computer security study, particularly, you know, for state government or something like that, that marshaled as many talented people who did as much good work in as short a time. It's really an incredible effort, and I think that it's historical. So there's been incredible work done in essentially looking at the security flaws in electronic voting machines. But I'm now going to do a bait and switch on you and say that this is not really the central problem that we have with electronic voting. So computer security people, particularly the wizards who are able to come up with new exploits and whatever, look at computer security, attack computer security problems in a particular way. And it's a way that's very valuable for voting, but I don't want people to lose sight of what the real problems are. And here's where I can put on my outsider hat, I hope. And I know that a lot of you understand all this, but a lot of the public doesn't understand it. And I think we need to make some effort to reinforce some of the points that I'm going to make to the general public. So one of the questions that comes to me if a reporter calls me after somebody finds some amazing, usually incredibly stupid way to break into a voting machine is, how worried should voters be about this problem? So at that point, there's usually a long silence because I hate that question. First of all, I don't want to discourage people from voting. Oh, the machines are going to steal your vote is not a message that I want to get out. But most of the reasons I just don't know how to answer the question. So, you know, on the one hand, we don't have any evidence that at least I think is convincing that's proof of large-scale electronic voting fraud. So I can't say, well, this guarantees that the next election is going to be stolen by so-and-so. On the other hand, there's no obvious evidence to the contrary. From what we know now, these machines could have stolen every election where they were used, so far as I can tell. The only control you have is really looking at polls and whether the results of the election are consistent with the polls. Most importantly, the incremental knowledge you get from knowing that somebody can break into the machine, I contend, does not greatly increase a sort of quantifiable measure, whatever you would have, of the insecurity of the machines. Before any studies were done, at the time the resolution on electronic voting was written, we knew the machines were vulnerable. We knew that there were people who could completely own those machines, who could have them do whatever they wanted in a way that, if it was done cleverly enough, would be virtually undetectable. And those were the insiders, the people with with legitimate access to the source code, who could make changes in the source code or the build environment or edit the binaries at key points in the chain. And so even without knowing that there are external attacks that are easily feasible on the machines, we knew enough to know that there was no basis for trusting them. And so those studies are valuable, but in some sense, they didn't greatly increase our knowledge about the most important thing about the machines. So another way of turning the question around is, if we fixed all of the vulnerabilities that people have identified by outsiders against these machines, how much better would the world be? How much more trustworthy would the machines be? And I don't really know the answer to that, because there are still the insiders, and I think that there are fundamental problems that make it virtually impossible to assure the trustworthiness of computer systems unless you have an independent, non-computer, software independent, I guess, check on the results of the machines. And I'm a little bit concerned that there could be a dangerous misconception by the public and by policymakers that all we have to do is design better electronic voting machines that don't have the security flaws, and the problem will be solved. Of course, the problem is that there's very little useful that we can do about insider attacks. So why is it that we focus on these external attacks instead of what I consider to be the core problem? Maybe it's because some people disagree and feel that the external attacks are important and that the internal attacks are not important, but I think that's not really the case. There are a bunch of reasons. I've been thinking about this. The first one is there's very little useful that you can do about the internal attacks. You can maybe try to vet the insiders a little better, do more careful inspections of the software or something like that, but you're up against a really hard problem. And so if you have a highly skilled computer security person who wants to figure out how to spend his or her time productively, maybe looking for possibilities of insider attacks is not the best way to do that. Of course, and I stole this notion from Dan Wallach, who pointed it out to me, if you're going to go look for insider attacks, what would you really look for? You might look for a back door, but as we'll learn from David, if you go actually look at these systems, you don't need to look for the back door. Like the whole back is missing. So that's ultimately a futile exercise. It's just not hard enough, basically. And so external attacks, you actually have to work a little harder, and it's more fun. Secondly, there are not a lot of solutions to the problem, and so it's unclear how computer security people can use their skills for that. Another extremely important point is whether you are just having fun and like being in the press, or whether you're trying to make the important public policy point to explain to election officials and to the public that there's a real problem here. An external attack just really makes a lot better story, and particularly a lot better demo than an internal attack. So if you can have a video of somebody spreading a virus on a Diebold machine, that is convincing at a visceral level in a way that showing how you can make a computer program be corrupt is not. And I've actually seen public forums where prominent election officials in the United States have stood up and said, well, I just really don't believe in all this stuff. Surely you could demonstrate an attack like this to us. That was, of course, before they had been demonstrated. I don't know where those election officials stand at this time. But there was a demand for a demo, and there were clearly people, very important people, who just wouldn't believe there was a problem unless you could show somebody breaking into a machine, which computer security people have now been able to do. Also, just in a, I guess, sense of PR or sales or politics, for some reason there are still a lot of people who think it's paranoid to consider attacks by vendors or employees. I think the problem here is that if you're talking about an external attacker, it could be anybody, right? If you're talking about an attack by an employee of a vendor, you have narrowed the scope of potential miscreants to a level where, you know, perhaps they could be enumerated by name, and that's considered offensive and insulting. And so I don't mean to offend or insult anyone, well, anyway, about that particular issue, but it makes people uncomfortable to talk about insider attacks because it sounds like a specific attack on specific people. So nevertheless, I think we do need to find, maybe we can tiptoe around the issue somehow or find different ways to present it, but I think we do have to talk about insider attacks. And one way I've tried to say this, you know, I don't know that there's anybody who owns a voting machine company who's trying to program the machines to steal votes. But no, democracy is not founded on trusting somebody who tells you the results of an election. It's founded on accountability and auditability and transparency of elections. So even if you don't trust people, you can see that the election results are on the up and up. And it is simply wrong in that sense. It's morally wrong to have a system that requires the voters to trust people they don't even know with their votes. And so what we ought to be doing is working for a system that doesn't require that. The purpose of elections is really to confer legitimacy upon the elected leaders. It's a dispute resolution mechanism where if you've got an argument over taxes or whatever, you say, okay, let's just put it to a vote. It's something we all do all the time on a large scale or a small scale. If you don't believe the results of the vote, you're in very serious trouble, and you have situations like we do in Mexico where they don't even use electronic voting, where the losing candidate says he's going to set up a parallel government. One thing that I've said about this is that it's not enough for elections to be accurate. We have to know that they're accurate. Even if elections were perfect, if people could challenge them on the grounds that there was some fraud or inaccuracy, it undermines the legitimacy of the elected leaders. And so we need somehow to be able to prove that the results of our elections are actually accurate. If you look at elections from the perspective of potential victims of insider fraud, it's an incredibly hard problem to stop. And you're probably easily convinced of this, but I'll rattle through the basic reasoning I have here in case you want to convince somebody else of it. First of all, it's traditional in computer security to allocate your resource wisely. Think about who the attackers can be, what their motivation might be, and what the resources might be. Now, if you look at an election, even in a county that I work in, Santa Clara County, there are land use decisions that are made by elected officials which may amount to billions of dollars. There are vast amounts of money at stake and other things when you're talking about control of the government. If you're talking about control of the US government, you know, that's a huge chunk of the world economy. So there's a lot of money at stake. If you look at the expenditures in the last presidential election, I believe they're over $1 billion. And so there's plenty of money sloshing around in the political system. And if you simply had somebody sufficiently unprincipled enough to want to steal elections, and of course we know that all politicians are ethical, you could conceivably have a problem here. Your attackers could be zealots or candidates, but they could also be organized crime or foreign governments, people with plenty of access to resources and any talent they may need to undermine an election. So you've got a serious problem that you need to defend against. Insider attacks are not not unlikely, and they're extremely difficult to stop. Now, if you've got lots of resources, you can get your people hired as programmers, or janitors. You can bribe employees of companies. You can even buy voting machine companies. So my recollection is that Sequoia, which is one of the 3 major vendors of voting equipment, was sold for only $13 million. In Silicon Valley, you know, a big house costs that much, and was bought by a Venezuelan company of unclear origin, which got started selling voting machines to the country of Venezuela. Lou Dobbs has made a big deal about this. I don't know how sinister it is, but you know, the going price for voting machine companies is a lot less than the going price for certain major offices in this country, just the campaign costs. It's also inherently difficult to build trustworthy voting systems. I don't know if anybody here is going to argue with me about this, but the basic arguments are we don't know how to eliminate bugs in systems. That actually is my research, and while I don't consider myself a professional failure, I don't feel that I've solved the problem either. We don't know how to design perfectly secure systems. I think. Anybody here know how to design perfectly secure systems? Ah, okay. So we have a nitpicker, and so I should add some additional requirements. They have to function and do something. But even then, a brick may not be secure either. I don't know. And then there's a huge attestation problem, right? Suppose that you could verify formally that the software did the right thing. You could do a security analysis and somehow determine that it's 100% secure. Then you go in and vote on your favorite voting machine in an election. How do you know that that voting machine actually has the stuff inside it, including not only the software but the hardware that it's supposed to have? And that's an unsolved problem at this point too. And while I won't claim that this is impossible to a technical audience, because technical audiences hate that word, I will claim that it'll be quite a few years before these problems are solved, if they ever are, adequately to give us trustworthy computing for voting. So I see as the only solution here to try to reduce the trusted computing base to essentially zero. And so that's why we recommend the voter-verified audit trail. And right now, at the time that the resolution on electronic voting was written, I was still of the belief that perhaps there was something involving cryptography and mixed nets or homomorphic encryption or whatever that might also allow us to do that electronically. After seeing the progress in that field and whatever, on the one hand, it's brilliant. On the other hand, I'm not persuaded that we're going to have a solution anytime soon. And one of the problems there is even if it's technically perfect, and everybody in this room agreed that it was technically perfect, we might have a great deal of difficulty explaining the skeptical public who doesn't have PhDs in computer science that in fact this system is trustworthy. In fact, if those people have to trust the system and they can't see why the system is trustworthy, then I think you have a big problem with transparency, even if you have a provably, mathematically provably good system. So I'm really stuck with the idea that we need voter-verified paper records at this time. So that has its own security requirements. So basically what we're doing is turning a computer security problem into a physical security problem. And so from the point where something is put in the ballot box, which can be something attached to an optical scan machine or actually just something where you drop your ballot into a box, to the point where there's the last recount of those things, you need to keep them physically secure. And it's not sufficient in my mind that they be physically secure. I think you also need for them to be physically secure in a publicly verifiable way. I shouldn't have to just believe that my election officials did the right things with these and listen to the security arrangements they tell me that they have made. I would like to be able to check. When they open the boxes, I would like to see the tamper-resistant security seals and be able to see that they're the same numbers that were on those boxes when they were sealed, or whatever the technology we have for that. And I'm not sure that that's a solved problem, but I believe that it's more of a solvable problem than the problem of making perfectly trustworthy electronic voting machines. Voters need to be able to verify the accuracy of these paper records. So, the obvious things, you need to get a record that has your vote on it, and you need to be able to look at that, and that should become the true record of the vote. You can have electronic copies around so long as you can go back to the paper record in the case of any dispute, and also in audits to make sure that the electronic records are actually accurate. So the current solutions that have been proposed, and these were actually proposed in 2003, are to attach a printer to a touchscreen machine. So the idea is you have your touchscreen machines, you have a printer on it that prints a copy of the votes. The voter can review that and either reject it or accept it so that that's available for a later audit. This was the second choice, I'm proud to say, in the resolution of electronic voting, the first being precinct count optical scan, which I'll talk about in a moment. The problem with putting printers on touchscreen machines it's really turned out to be problematic, and there are actually a lot of problems. My biggest worry is that it's difficult psychologically to get people to check, at least individuals who are not involved in some formal auditing process, to get every individual or a significant fraction of individuals to carefully check the results of a computer. After all, computers are supposed to be correct. And even knowing what I know about electronic voting, and when I have test voted on one of these machines, I've been perhaps not as careful on checking that electronic printout, the paper printout, as I should have been. And I'm afraid that average voters are not going to do a sufficiently good job of checking those printouts. Now, right now we have a situation where in some elections there's an opaque barrier over the top of the record which voters are told not to remove because they might compromise their privacy, thus rendering it impossible for them to inspect this record. So we can do a lot better with usability of the machines and with educating the public about how they're supposed to use these things. But even in the best case, I'm a little worried about how carefully people will check these things. My favorite system, and the one that was first in the list in the resolution of electronic voting, was precinct count optical scan. With precinct count optical scan systems, the voters fill out the ballots themselves. They're like a standardized exam. And then they put them into a scanner at the polling place, which will check the ballot to look for overvotes in particular and kick it back at the voter if it's mismarked so the voter can repair it. These things statistically have very, very low error rates. They're as low as the best touchscreen machines, lower in some studies. And they have the paper trail. If the machine breaks, you can fill out the ballot anyway without having the scanner there. It can be taken and scanned later or counted by hand. And so it's very robust and resistant to denial of service attacks. I should mention that that scanner is also the ballot box. So if it doesn't get kicked back to you, it goes into the ballot box. You can leave. I've voted on this kind of system many times where I live. I don't vote more than once. And I have found that it's fast and it's easy. And I'm in and out in a hurry, and it's a wonderful system. The only issue with optical scan systems, and this has been a huge issue in the United States for various political reasons, is disability access. So one of the first things you need to learn if you get involved in electronic voting is that accessibility by people with disabilities is an incredibly, a show-stopping legal issue and an incredibly important political issue, because the disability groups actually have very effective lobbyists, and they have a lot of people who are very sympathetic in Congress to them. And that's a good thing, but it means that regardless of, it means that the issue cannot be ignored. And if your main focus is on the integrity of elections, you still have to focus on disability access, because if the problem is not solved, you're going to be going against the law. So with optical scan systems, the current best solution, and I don't think it's quite good enough, but I think it's the best solution that we have, is the use of ballot marking devices. With these things, it provides a touch screen interface or audio interface that can read and write on an optical scan ballot in the same way that a person without disabilities can read and write the same ballot. It's like a very expensive pen or pencil that provides an audio interface and, say, a sip and puff device for people who can't manipulate a pen directly and that sort of thing. And these are now widely used in the United States, and in terms of accessibility are probably as good or better than many of the touchscreen machines. The touchscreen machines, in spite of all the promises made about accessibility, and in spite of the fact that accessibility was the concern driving many of the very large purchases of touchscreen machines around the United States, have been rather disappointing. The actual design and performance of machines has not been up to what they were advertised, and I think that a number of people with disabilities have become a bit disillusioned with those machines over time. Finally, it's not enough to have an audit trail if you don't do any auditing, right? In order to get the use of a voter-verified paper record, hopefully an optical scan record, you need to do careful auditing. And so the standard solution to this is for each county, say in California, to choose a certain number of precincts at random, do careful hand counts of a small percentage of the ballots, or all of the ballots in a small percentage of the precincts, in order to compare the totals that they get by hand with the electronic totals. And at least for large elections, if we work all the bugs out of our current procedures, I think that that's going to be an adequate way to ensure the trustworthiness of the results. There's a lot of discussion now about better ways to do auditing the statistics. What percentage should we audit? Should we audit larger percentages if the election is close? My answer is yes. That seems obvious at this point. Are there ways of auditing? It turns out with auditing that what matters is the absolute number of batches of ballots. If you take all of the ballots you have and divide them into piles, it doesn't really matter how big the piles are. What matters is how many of the absolute number of those piles that you can audit. And there are various potential improvements to the auditing process that can be made by auditing smaller numbers of ballots, by making the piles more batches of smaller size so that you don't have to count so many ballots and you get more bang per counted ballot. And of course, the smallest piles you can have, well, maybe you could subdivide a ballot, but let's say the smallest piles you can have are 1 ballot per pile, just comparing a paper record and an electronic record. If we can find a good way to do that that surmounts all the other obstacles, then we could have very effective auditing of paper ballots. So what's the status of this? So it's, you know, depending on whether you're a glass half empty or glass half full kind of person, you can either say we've made incredible progress or we have a long way to go, because both of those things are true. It's been amazing to watch what's happened since 2003. So I don't know exactly how many states had some sort of paper trail requirement, voter-verified paper trail requirement in 2003, but it was much less than half of them. It's probably 12 or 13. Now there are 28 states that have voter-verified paper record requirements in one form or another. Those include New York and California, so it's not only more than half the states, it's much more than half the US population. And most of the laws, including California's, passed after, you know, I was able to see them happen after January 2003. Manual auditing is catching on. It's not as widespread as I wish it were, but there are 13 states that have some kind of manual auditing requirement where they pick a random set of precincts or whatever and hand count them. There's more to be done there, but that's about 12 states more than there were when we started. And they include large states as well. However, in the long way to go, there are significant numbers of voters that have only paperless machines to vote on. Of US voters here, how many of you vote in a place that has only electronic voting with no paper trail? Okay, so Pittsburgh is that way, I believe, although in some places you can vote absentee on paper. A lot of places in Pennsylvania are. The state of Georgia is entirely electronic. There are other southern states that are predominantly electronic voting. Large counties in Texas are all electronic. So there are a lot of votes being cast electronically. Florida has a lot of large electronic counties, but they have decided to go to paper trails, which is an amazing development. I thought Florida was completely hopeless, but they're going to be in the vanguard shortly. Okay, so in summary, I think, you know, the ultimate solution here, I think we need to keep pressing on the external attacks. I think we need to keep pointing out how bad the designs of those machines are and how insecure they are. But we also need to emphasize the necessity to be able to audit these machines and the transparency and the fact that fixing the security holes is either not doable or it's not going to give us trustworthy voting if we're just fixing external attacks. I worry a little bit about this. I worry that fixing the external attacks will make people a little complacent, and not very seriously, I've pondered the notion of trying to keep people on their toes by having the satanic voting machine company with a little devil icon on each voting machine, have them randomly introduce errors for the purpose of making sure that voters check stuff and that the people count, just like you want to occasionally run some fake guns through the not you, that the federal authorities should occasionally test how well the inspectors are doing at the airports by running fake weapons through. And no, I'm not going to do this. But I'm not going to seriously propose that because I just have this innate political sense that it's not going to get that kind of traction that I would really like. So in other remaining work, we've still got to get paper trails, preferably optical scan ballots in the parts of the country that don't have it. We need to get laws requiring auditing throughout the country. There are currently federal bills pending, including H.R. 811, which might actually pass the House. I'm not sure what's going to happen in the Senate. This is the famous Holt bill that's on its third iteration, I think, since it was first introduced in 2003. So we need to get the paper trails. We need to get auditing throughout the country. But we have a lot of other problems that we're going to have to deal with. When you actually look at the procedures that are used in elections, especially with the suspicious eye of a security expert, you see lots of potential flaws that have not been considered. When you look at the procedures for auditing, in some places it's done pretty well. In a lot of places you see things, I heard of a case where if they're looking at the paper trails, this was in California, and they find that one of them is illegible, what they do is print a new copy of the paper trail so they can count them more easily, which somewhat subverts the voter verified aspect of the whole thing. So there are a lot of problems with auditing processes, and we really need to go through district by district in the United States, step by step, looking at the procedures and making sure that they're reasonably airtight and basically propagating best practices throughout the country. One of the things that foreigners are surprised about in the US is how decentralized our election system is. And there are so many different rules and whatever that elections are run differently in every single county of the United States, sometimes very badly and sometimes very well. And there really, at this point, is not a good forum for election officials to exchange their best practices and kind of optimize and standardize things in the way that by combining the best practices of the best election districts of the country. So a final thing that we need with elections, and this is really a legal problem, is to make remedies more available. You can have elections that are quite visibly flawed where the wrong candidate got elected and that candidate just stays in office. It's hard to redo an election. Sometimes it's hard to get a recount, 100% recount. And that's not a computer security problem, but once you have done all the computer security and all the auditing and you find out that your election is broken, you do need to go fix it somehow. And the United States has not been particularly good at that. So I'm going to conclude here. I hope we have plenty of time for discussion because that was one of my goals. My main message is let's try to step back a little bit and keep our eyes on the main goal. Our main goal is trustworthy elections, and the only way that can be achieved is by greater transparency. Computer security is critical. It's critical for pointing out that the machines aren't trustworthy in the first place, and it's critical for finding and getting fixed the vulnerabilities. But it's neither necessary nor sufficient. Do I mean to say that? It's not sufficient for trustworthy elections, and I guess one could make the case that it's not absolutely necessary. It's simply important. You can shout at me after I conclude the talk. I think that most of you understood this before I said anything here, but the general public still doesn't. They think that security is something that's achievable rather than something that's sort of a spectrum or a temporary stronghold in a ground that is temporarily gained in a continuing war. And so they don't really understand. And so I'd like to close by just thanking everybody who, I made this plea in 2003, and I'd like to thank the people who've worked so hard in this community on helping improve both the security and the trustworthiness of our voting systems. You've made a very important contribution to democracy, and I think the world would be a much worse place without what you've done. Some of you here haven't gotten involved yet, and I'd like to urge you to do so. The old-timers here, or at least the people who are aging rapidly because of their work on this issue, are going to burn out. And the price of liberty is truly eternal vigilance, and that means in this community as well. If we had a perfect voting system and then we all walked away from it and ignored it, in a few years the situation would be as bad or worse than it was a few years ago. And so we need more of you to get involved and step up when the rest of us collapse. So thank you very much, and I hope we'll have some questions and discussion.
Hi, thank you. First, I'd like to point out to the gentleman that said you can secure a computer by turning it off. That does ignore the physical aspect of security, so you actually have to encase it in enough concrete that it can't be carried away either or destroy you.
This wasn't mentioned in the recommendations to the California Secretary of State.
Well, I'm sure the concrete lobby would be happy to lobby on behalf of that solution. For those of us who probably won't ever do more than just get into heated cocktail party arguments on this issue, what do you say to those, and you covered this a bit, what do you say to those that, paper trails really aren't any better than electronic trails, this isn't really any worse than it was before, and they can of course point out the the famous picture of the the guy with the dangling Chad thing from Florida as evidence to that.
Well, you know, not surprisingly, I do occasionally have to defend myself against comments like this. You know, a picture of a guy with a magnifying glass. I don't know, there are a lot of answers depending on the specific question, right? People have learned the wrong lesson about the Florida recount. You know, the problem in Florida was a bad technology, which was the punch cards, which provably lose a lot of votes, and at least in California, lose more votes for minority voters than for majority voters. And so it's a bad technology, but Florida also failed to have the appropriate recount laws to actually deal with the problem. People learn the lesson that recounts are bad things, and that's not the right lesson. You need to have orderly recounts, and you have to know what your remedy is going to be when you get the results of the recount. Recounts are actually wonderful things. They're part of the checks and balances that can help us do our elections. As to you know, a detailed discussion of different modes of election fraud can go on for quite a while, but I'll give the first order answer. If you're looking at paper-based election fraud, say, you know, with a completely manual system, as it might have happened 100 years ago, versus electronic fraud, what you've done is convert retail fraud into wholesale fraud. The number of people who have to get involved in order to create large-scale fraud with electronic voting machines is one. And I think if you ask David Wagner about how that might happen with the systems that were reviewed in California, he can give you more specifics and who that person could be. It's pretty frightening. If you look at paper ballot systems, people understand paper pretty well. Having paper ballots doesn't guarantee the absence of fraud, but having paper ballots gives you the hope of minimizing fraud if you put in place the right procedures and laws and have observers at the right parts of the process. It becomes a tractable problem rather than a problem that's where a solution has been foreclosed by non-transparent technology. Yes?
Very, very quick comment and a sincere question. The quick comment is you said that you mentioned Mexico at one point offhandedly as not being a client of electronic voting systems. In fact, Mexico implemented electronic tally systems very early on, largely because the PRI wanted effective methods for wholesale stealing of elections. Without those systems, it required enormous amounts of local bribery in order to steal the. No one should laugh. This is not funny, because we're, you know, I mean, if without people being really vigilant, this will be the United States. Anyway, they were, you know, they had problems with the necessity to involve lots of people at the retail level, shall we say, in dealing with it. And by implementing electronic central tally systems, they were able to steal whole elections. I'll happily get you some references later on this because it is actually interesting in context. But the question I've got is, so I live in New York State, where we've had New York State has been very, very dysfunctional in upgrading their systems. How do I get myself involved in trying to make a difference and make sure that they do not end up with the wrong ones? And you've encouraged people to get involved. I don't really know how to get involved.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's always a problem with getting involved is how do you actually do it and who do you talk to. Yeah, the New York situation is complicated. They've really been slow to do their upgrade, but they have at least put a lot of work into not doing the wrong thing. And so far that's been by not doing anything, but they're headed in not the wrong direction. New Yorkers for Verified Voting is, I believe, a pretty good organization with which...
Is that the Brennan Center people?
No, the Brennan Center, I also believe, has been a very important organization, not just in New York, but nationally. New Yorkers for Verified Voting is more of an advocacy organization, and I can talk to you about it later, who to contact.
Okay.
Peter.
Quick comment on the paper situation. Paper, there's good paper and there's bad paper.
We don't want the bad paper.
We don't want the bad paper. In 1988 in Florida, there was a case, I think, that should have been opening the eyes of a lot of people long before 2000, where in the in all of the counties except the 4 punched card counties, there was the same number of votes for the Senate race as for the president. In the 4 punched card counties, Palm Beach, Miami-Dade, and so on, 210,000 votes disappeared. 14% drop-off in the Senate race. There were manipulated card decks where the Republican slot had a needle run through it, so every card in the deck had a punch, which effectively disabled all of the Democratic votes in the same precincts, which were, as it turns out, heavily Democratic precincts. There was a great deal of shall we say, hanky-panky that went on. And people never learned the lesson that punch cards could be
well, of course, the 2000 situation, so far as we know, there were no proven instances of large-scale fraud. The larger problem is that punch cards for decades before that had been known to have this hanging chad problem.
Yep.
And I know there are lots of security problems
Yep.
as well, but that was really led to the Florida problem.
Well, the problem was on some of the machines that the chad slots were stuffed and you couldn't actually get the needle through the card deck, which resulted in hanging chad, not surprisingly. And in fact, some people were able to get machines on eBay that still had all the chad stuffed in the slots. So that was one point. But I think the one thing I thought your talk was terrific, by the way. You really have given a very clear picture on the whole thing. The one thing you really didn't get into was the end-to-end nature of the voting process. The fact that the registration process has been corrupted, that the voter authentication process has been corrupted, and that the electronic machines and even the paper are just a piece of this puzzle. So you might speak a little bit to that.
Well, I'm going to speak about something else. As a matter of persuasion, let's see. Yeah, so I'm not going to agree with any claims about vote fraud unless I see a successful prosecution, except for maybe a few of my favorite instances that I've heard about. And clearly there are some issues with, let's see. I think one of the I'm just going to remark on a tangential point, that one of the things that I set out to do here was say, when I got involved in this battle, was to look at what my strengths and weaknesses were, and why should somebody listen to me as opposed to listening to some PR person for one of the vendors or a politician or whatever. And the only thing that really makes me different from other people is that I'm a computer scientist, and there are certain things that I have the credentials to make and the background and the knowledge to make strong claims about. Those don't really include election fraud. And so I try to keep the discussion on a set of rather bedrock principles that are very hard to dispute. And I think that's easy to do in elections, right? You can say, okay, we have one principle that the results of elections should be accurate, okay? Anybody who doesn't think that that's true, okay, we're just not going to be able to have a useful discussion about it. But if you accept that, then we can get into issues of voting machine security and error rates and the details of how voter registration works and that sort of thing. And that a lot of this debate can be put on a very solid, objective foundation. And for technical people, that's something we're good at. We're good at facts, and we're good about debating issues where there actually might be yes-no answers that we might be able to get to the truth about. One of the things I've discovered in entering a little bit more political realm is that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily think that way, and not everybody is as fact-oriented as we might be. And surprisingly, not everybody just takes the word of a computer scientist about computers as gospel. So, we wrote the resolution for electronic voting, and I figured a bunch of computer scientists will sign up this, and after we have spoken, then the politicians will say, the computer scientists have spoken. let us fix this situation. In a month, I'd be back to whatever I was doing. It didn't quite work out that way. The gentleman at the microphone in the back, you've been bypassed in the line here.
Okay. I live across the river in Cambridge. We have an unusual voting system, but I wondered if you'd like to comment on things which are not actually done by counting. I mean PR, proportional rep, where in fact the votes are allocated by a randomization procedure, which, I don't know that I want to give a tutorial on PR, but it's an interesting system. It's used in Israel. Was used for Board of Education in New York City. There are a variety of places it's used, but there's an explicit randomization business, which is different, I think, than just counting. And of course, now I would view that as vastly harder to get right in the certification sense that you mean.
I don't know a lot about proportional representation. The issue that we keep bumping up against is instant runoff voting or various other kinds of preferences.
That would be equivalent, so go ahead, instant runoff.
And, I try to stick to one issue at a time, so while I'm kind of sympathetic with the concerns, I understand what the rationale is behind those systems, I try to stay neutral about them. But let me say that there is a tension, as you're noting, between innovations in elections and trying to catch up on the technology side, especially when you throw in questions about auditability and transparency and security. And I think that's a situation we'll have to live with, and I hope that we can reconcile these things, I spend a certain amount of time trying to avoid fights between people who want a new voting system that's going to be more transparent and people who want a new voting system that's going to have IRV. I'm not always successful in that, but I think it's just, you're right, it probably does make it harder if just because the rules are changing and it takes us a while to figure out how to deal with the changed rules. It's just another complication we're going to have to deal with along with the 36 other ones.
Yeah, that's fine. It's sort of an odd place to run into this. I mean, Cambridge, of course, is dense with fact-based, argumentative, blah, blah, blah people. Yeah. And the city council, shall we say, represents none of them as a rule. So it's just fascinating that we use, by the way, electronic means to count paper ballot. These are punch card ballots, and we use electronic means to count them. They've converted to, I should say, optical sense cards. Mm-hmm. You draw a dot as opposed to punch a dot.
Oh, really? Okay.
But the counting, of course, in this case, because there's a complicated, elaborate procedure which includes randomization, you could, in a much easier way, algorithmically, produce results you would like that would be much harder in the verification sense to conclude.
Yeah, here's a positive way of looking at it. It's another set of really interesting questions for smart people with sort of computer
Well, take it on.
orientations to think about.
That'd be swell, thanks.
So that's another way you can get involved. Yes?
You focused a lot of attention on the voting machines. There's also computers that are upstream that collect the votes, and you didn't say anything about those. Is that because there's no issues there, or what's
well, there's certainly David can speak to specific issues that they have found in California, and in fact, from a computer security perspective, the issues are probably a lot worse. From the perspective of auditing, it seems to me, although we haven't gotten our act together, that we could get our act together relatively easily. Basically, this is the election management system which tallies the results from the individual precincts or whatever and generates reports. And the question is, suppose your precincts are honest, but somebody does the easy thing and just changes the votes in the central server. And the way you check that is that you make public, via an independent path, the results from each precinct. And then, so anybody can add them up in a spreadsheet and see that the results are the same as those reported by the election management system. That requires some organization. A lot of places, including California, have laws saying that the precinct results have to be posted on the door of the polling place at the end of the election. That's a very common practice, and it's left over from the good old days when the politicians would send around runners to try to find out if they were winning or losing as quickly as possible after the election. But it's very useful for transparency if we could have a program, as various people have tried to organize in the past, of get volunteers to run around with digital cameras and take pictures of these things. Better yet, print a copy for each poll worker, any witnesses who are present, issue the copies to them, and then have them log in and check if the results reported for their precinct were the same as what they got from the precinct when the election closed. So I think it's a solvable problem. Unfortunately, it largely hasn't been solved, but I don't think we necessarily have to redesign our computer systems in order to deal with it. Yes?
Less of a question, more of a comment on, you mentioned auditing being important, and I think that's something that's often missed. The elections in the UK give a very good example of this. I was an election monitor for one of the 6 optical scan trials. Out of the 6 trials, 3 failed to return a result at all. One just said XML error and no result. Of the 3 that did return a result, there was no auditing, or almost no auditing. There was no auditing in the plan. On the demand of one of the candidates, there was a single audit of 300 votes, which should have been 300 votes. The manual count found 600. So there was almost just under 50% undercount by the electronic counting optical scan system.
Oh.
Yes. Oh.
Sounds like you had a problem.
Yeah. If anyone's interested in this, the results were published by the Open Rights Group. If you Google for Open Rights Group, you can find the report where they talked about this and many, many other problems.
So one of the things that's been very interesting since 2003 is in 2003, I remember having a very hard time digging up good documented stories of problems with electronic voting. And I don't know if I thought they were rare or just weren't reported on. But after the issue started getting some attention, the number of problems that people would find was just astronomically more than an issue. I remember finding 2 good ones to put in our frequently asked questions file or something in early 2003. And I remember the delight we had at discovering that, 93 votes or something like that had been lost in Wake County because at that time vendors were saying, no vote has ever been lost in an electronic voting system. And so we said, well, what about these 93? That claim doesn't stand up anymore. So the claim got progressively narrower until it was, well, no votes have ever been lost in an election in an odd-numbered day on a Tuesday in a southern state before, whenever. And so we've kind of won that part of the debate. In the back?
Yeah, I want to thank you very much for your work in this area. I just think it is so important to our democracy and also for the other computer researchers that have been involved in this as well. I feel like I've really not stepped up myself to do work in this area, even though I feel strongly and passionately about this. It does look like there's a lot of work to get into the specifics of this field to really speak authoritatively about it. But I wonder if you couldn't provide sort of some soundbite for us security researchers so we would have those essentially soundbite items that we could speak that with authority and communicate to our friends, colleagues, and maybe even the media as speaking as security researchers.
Well, I guess we need a file of sound bites or something on the web. There are a lot of questions that you have to field here, and with practice, your answers get better over time. Would you like to ask me a question and hear my sound bite?
Right.
What's the question you're most worried about?
Okay. Well, okay. So maybe that question can't be answered. So how about a secondary question? Is to actually contribute as a security researcher.
Well, I'll tell you one of my most important sound bites, which I just gave for 45 minutes here. So it's not quite. It could be reduced to bumper sticker size, but. When people ask me about security of voting machines, I say that's really not the problem. What we really need to think about is transparency. Mm-hmm. And that, you need everybody to be able to see that the election results are accurate. And so that has the advantage. It used to be that people were constantly challenging me to prove that there was election fraud. That's not the issue. The question is, can you trust the election, which depends on transparency. Right. And so that's a matter of framing the debate in a way that's actually much more accurately reflects the real problem and doesn't create a challenge for you, doesn't direct the conversation off into the weeds where you may lose the debate, but most importantly, you're arguing about the wrong thing.
Well, there's a lot of power in this room. Speaking as a security expert, I believe that you can speak with authority. And talking about the difficulty of creating trust in these fundamentally insecure systems, it's it's extremely difficult, as we all know, to achieve trust. And so your point about transparency, it's a more of a process issue than a technology issue.
Well, nobody's disputed, I said it's practically impossible to make these trustworthy voting systems all electronic. And there are a few people who will dispute me. And I could enumerate them, but I won't, I guess. There are some people who are advocates of cryptographic voting who think you can do it without paper, small number. And there are maybe one or two computer scientists. There's one guy who will say, he has a secret foolproof way of finding malicious code. So, if you want to make up tally marks for who's on each side, anybody, you want to argue with me about whether there's a foolproof way of finding malicious code, I may defer to the expertise in this room, but I don't see anybody standing up to say it. Yeah.
Continuing the talk about transparency, there are a lot of new protocols coming online in which you're given a cryptographic receipt, and so you have Joe or Alice voter coming in and getting cryptographic receipts, and then they're expected to go home and kind of verify that their vote's been counted and all this. But in a way, if you don't expect people to have PhDs in computer science or math, where do you see the importance of education for the voters in this whole problem of voting? A parallel question to that is, you're talking to computer security people. Are you also involving human factors people as well in your plea to make systems more trustworthy and open?
And these two questions are related, right? So I certainly agree with you that human factors, say in Florida with punch cards, right? And with lots of other systems, that human factors may be more important to the accuracy of voting systems than, certainly in terms of demonstrated problems with elections, that most of the problems are probably human factors. I've been involved a little bit in the recent 2006 Sarasota election, where there are 18,000 mysterious undervotes, a much higher percentage for the same congressional, this is the Congressional District 13 race. The undervote rate is between, I think, 12 and 18%, depending on which voters you're talking about and whether it's early voting or on election day. That's vastly higher than it usually is, vastly higher than in comparable races on the same ballot, and vastly higher than the same race on absentee paper ballots in the same county or in neighboring counties that have exactly the same equipment. So there's clearly a problem there, and the hypothesis, which I don't necessarily buy, but the hypothesis that seems to have been accepted by a number of people for this is that this is largely the result of a ballot layout problem. And this determined the outcome of a congressional race. And if you do the statistics a lot of different ways, you find that the person who is occupying that seat is not the person that the most voters intended to vote for. So this is the kind of problem we have, and it's very likely, I don't know that that's fully a usability problem, but it's very likely that usability is a major factor in that. So this happens all the time. Have I personally involved usability people? They're getting involved. The Accurate project, which I belong to, has one very good usability person at Rice University who's collaborating with the rest of us. I do wish there were more people involved. And I do wish that the usability and security people could find a meeting of the minds on more details of this issue.
Hi, I'm curious what you think about reducing the reliance on election procedure. So the last couple of elections, I volunteered as a poll worker, and there was me, 24 years old, somebody who was 40, and everyone else was over 70 at both the last elections that I worked at. And while that's not to say that people who are over 70 are necessarily not going to be able to use these machines, they definitely treated them like they were from another planet. And they deferred all operation of the machine to me. And so the last election, I was a touchscreen inspector, as they call them. And I had 8 of these touchscreen machines sitting in my apartment for a week. And there seems to be so much...
You had a wonderful opportunity, which
Yes.
David can talk to you about.
And, there are lots of people go in and out of my apartment.
Where was this, by the way?
In San Diego.
Oh, good. The famous San Diego sleepovers.
Yes, I guess so.
Did your candidate win the election?
No, I don't think so. I don't remember, actually. But it seems like
Because he's a masochist.
So it turns out that there was, a several hundred-page manual with lots of really obscure instructions on the procedures for using these machines. And I'm wondering, how do you think we should get, the procedure out of the loop? Because that seems to be
I think the answer to your question is obvious. The vague answer is obvious. The specific answer is really hard, which is we need to make elections simpler. And part of that is a technology problem. Because the reason, first of all, voters are everybody. They have a process that they go through that does have inherent complexity because of the complexity of our ballots, regardless of the technology they're voting on. And they do it maybe once every 2 years. And so that, I refuse to program my VCR. I have to believe out of professional pride that I could do it, but I'm too lazy, and the intellectual effort is just too much after a hard day of working with computers. So I perfectly understand that people don't want to deal with this stuff. And if you have a complex task that people don't get to practice, and if they don't get good feedback about whether they did it right, you are going to have mistakes. But the issue you raised about poll workers is not raised very often. It's very important. We're relying on poll workers who are basically volunteers, who also do the work a small number of times a year for very long days, and they have to deal with this complicated task. In addition to just administering the election and dealing as technicians, basically, with the equipment, these people also have a vital role in democracy, which is to serve as witnesses to the legitimacy of the processes of the election. And they're being distracted by all this other administrative stuff that they have to do. So we need to have an organized effort to try to simplify basically all aspects of elections, including the poll workers' jobs. And specifically how to do that, I don't know, but it's something we need to think about with both the technology and the procedures and the law and other aspects of how elections are run. What's a VCR? Oh, yeah. The other reason I can't program my VCR is I'm just too damned old. Yes?
Yeah, this is pretty much related to that. You mentioned in your talk that the decentralization, the different technologies in county by county. Is that something, if you're going to do all this effort to try to solve every single voting machine problem, what has to be done to federalize, have one single voting machine? Can that be done? Does it require a constitutional amendment? Does it require, because I think whenever I have a system that I need to work on, the first thing I do is look at components and see which ones I can replace with common components, try to just get standardization between the different, and that would, to me, be the first thing to do before you even look at a single security bug.
There are places who have done this to various degrees who promote that advantage. So the technical answer, which is actually a legal answer, is what it would, the important thing about US elections is that Congress more or less can do what it wants with federal elections for federal offices, subject to special constitutional provisions for the presidency. There are various specific rules for Congress and whatever about how elections work in the Constitution. But with the Voting Rights Act, the Help America Vote Act, the federal government has a lot of authority over federal elections. It has relatively little authority over state and local elections. Now, if you passed a law saying all federal elections will be conducted on the, whatever box, then places would probably choose to run their local and state elections on it just because it's easier. Right. I'm not convinced that it would be a good idea because, as I mentioned in 2003, a lot of states and localities were contemplating buying electronic voting. A lot of them didn't, right? A lot of them waited to see what was going to happen with the other counties. We now have a situation where it's sort of like in agriculture. If you're optimized your wheat to grow at the maximum rate and have a monoculture, then you get some sort of vicious kind of wheat rust that comes out and wipes out the whole crop. And while if you have not a monoculture, whatever that's called, a multiculture, I don't know. If you have diversity in your crops, then you're less vulnerable to that. And I think I've actually seen that happen in the United States. So I'm reluctant to embrace that. I also think it's, never mind constitutional amendments, it's not going to happen in the near future because it's a politically, in Congress, extremely unpopular idea.
I understand, and I was even going to bring that up. If you have one, it's easier to fool. But in the way that when you talk about the presidential, the national, any national office, you're talking about you only have to affect a couple of them anyway. you only have to know what's, of the three big voting machine manufacturers, you only have to know a vulnerability in one, because the way it's set up, the margins of victory are so small to begin with. You only need to hit one state, maybe, let's say. So
well, you know, these
doesn't
things
that boil
are
down
running,
to one
I mean,
system anyway?
you've got a, you know, if Diebold, or if you were able to corrupt all the Diebold machines in the country, you could swing a lot of elections. That's true.
So unless there's 400, and, you know.
But, you know, a lot of places we're still using paper optical scan systems. There are a lot of, you know, some places we're still doing hand counts. And most importantly, you know, in 2002, right after the Help America Vote Act, if Congress had said, we're all going to buy this kind of machine, then we would have had, you know, I don't know how many 100,000 electronic voting machines throughout the country. It would have been extremely difficult to do what we've done. We've made very little progress at the federal level, actually, unfortunately, at straightening out this election integrity problem. We've made tremendous progress on a state-by-state and county-by-county basis. We've influenced the decisions that are made in states and counties about what equipment to buy, and we've gotten laws passed in individual states requiring better procedures and requiring paper trails. And we've missed some states, but that wouldn't have, you know, empirically, that hasn't been possible to do at the federal level.
So you prefer bottom up, and even though it's probably more resource intensive?
Yeah, you know, I understand completely the problems you're talking about, the bottom up, but if I look at the history of what's happened since I got involved, bottom up has been better. I won't say it's the absolute rule, but that's how it's worked out for me. Maybe one more question. I don't know when the break is or whatever.
One quick comment.
Yeah.
You sort of gave the impression that New York was, I wouldn't say negligent, but was sort of dragging its heels. I voted on a lever machine in 1950 in New York, and they're still using them. The reason they're still using them is that there's one real hero, I think, of this whole community. That's Doug Kellner, who was the head of the New York City Board of Elections for many years, and he's now on the state board. I think there are a few people in government, such as he, who have recognized that it was a little bit risky to go into machines that had essentially no audit trail and no ability to do a recount and no ability to have any integrity whatsoever long ago, and they have stuck to their guns. So it's whether the glass is half full or half empty. I consider that a tremendous boon to the community. Even though they may be in violation of HAVA, they have actually been one of the real outliers in this race, if you will, feeding frenzy to get into the...
Yeah, I guess a polite way to describe New York's process, and an accurate way, is that they've been deliberate. So, you know, they've been thinking very carefully about it. They have missed some legal deadlines and whatever, but you know, it's hard to make decisions in New York as it is in California sometimes, and I think that they're slowly headed down the right path. There have been a lot of heroic election officials. As a community, election officials have been skeptical, to say the least, of what we have to say. There have been a number of visionary election officials. I guess I hesitate to single one out, but I think that Deborah Bowen in California has really set things, you know, gotten in the news a lot with this top-to-bottom review, but I think it was the right thing to do, and it's something that might have been difficult for another election official to do. So we've, in the Accurate Project, we've talked to her, and she's rather unique among these people and being able to hold her own in a room full of computer scientists. There's some things that she knows more about than I do, and it's rare that you find somebody you can communicate in an office with at a technical level in an office like that. Okay, so with